And the last thing I want to talk about before I'm done and before we have our breakout type sessions is this. You know, I've talked a little bit about what some of these privileges are. Some of them are material, some of them are psychological, some of them are very real and personal to us. And other times when I've gone through the whole litany, which I won't do here tonight because I saw in the handout, you know, we're taking it for granted that there is this thing called white privilege. We're not here to debate that, right? And so I'm not going to have to prove it and go through all the permutations of proof that I might, you know. But sometimes when I do that, it's very interesting because what very perceptive people in the audience will do is they'll say, well, Tim, hey man, you did a great job. You ran down all those privileges. You and Peggy McIntosh list all these privileges. Good stuff, man. You did it. You convinced some of your folks tonight that there's this thing called white privilege. Now answer me one question. Now that you've done your job and you've proven how many privileges there are, tell me why in the world all these folks that you've just convinced would want to give that up. Because we're not a culture that tells you to get rid of your privileges. Am I right? Right? Our parents teach us to count our blessings, not give them away. Right? Be grateful for what you have. Not so you can give it away, just so you'll be grateful. Right? We're supposed to take advantage of our advantage. That's what our culture tells us to do. Our very competitive culture tells us you capitalize on your advantages. You take advantage of them. So if you prove that there's this thing called white privilege, the natural reaction, even of good-hearted, decent people in the white community, is to say, well, damn, you know, I didn't realize all that, but now that I do, I'm not going to give that. I'm not a fool. What am I, some kind of idiot? I mean, I feel bad and all, but I'm not, whoa, you know. So the question is, why would you give it up? And I think this is a very important and unanswered question in this movement. We've got to explain this in a way that allows those of us called white to understand what in fact is in it for the entire community to eliminate white privilege. Because see, it's my position that white privilege is not just effective at killing people of color, it is killing white people. Now we don't realize it, but for the vast majority of people defined in this culture as white, this privilege is destroying us. It's destroying us internally, it's destroying us externally. It costs us billions of dollars every year on a purely financial level, discrimination against people of color who are, in fact, not just people of color, black folks alone. This is who the study's been done on. If it had been done on Latinos and Asian Pacific Americans and Native peoples, the number would be much higher. Discrimination just against black folks and just in the labor market costs the country $240 billion a year in lost income every single year. That's the entire economy, not just black folks that lose that. Our economy loses that. It's about 4.5% of our overall economy every year, just sort of gone because people aren't being paid what they're worth. And so then they can't pay taxes at the same level as others. They can't produce as productively. They're not as efficient as workers because their productive capacity is not being tapped. You know all the economic theories, right? And so on the one level, it's just a huge waste of money which harms us all. But even more than that, white privilege allows those of us defined as white to remain isolated. 80 to 85% of white folks live in communities where there are almost no people of color around in that direct neighborhood or adjoining neighborhoods, which means we are isolated and we know far less about people of color than they know about us, which isn't very functional for a nation that is increasingly not like us and a world that never was, right? For a long time, we were able to live under this illusion that the world was white and that America was...
Now, you know it is an amazing thing when wrong is acknowledged and reparations is issued, right? That is when we as humans, or rather someone who feels oppressed, has a sense of justice. But when someone does not even have the thought of coming and acknowledging they did wrong, how then should we think that we have justice? Because justice is always issued on the first premise, the premise that wrong has been acknowledged. And when wrong has been acknowledged, from that process, we can start a restorative process of acknowledging and maybe giving back what you stole, paying back for the harm you caused. There are different methods of restoring justice. There is different methods of ensuring that the harmed people, or rather the weaker people in the society, are fed justice and the society is balanced as it should be. The black people in the Americas are likened to the people who are weak and people who have been stolen off their justice, people who have been stolen of their identity, because the slave trade was not just a slave trade. The slave trade was more than what we are being told. It broke families. It was traumatic. It brought about the loss of lives. There are some generations which just got wiped out by this slavery. The remnants we see today, the black Americans, these are people who are just the people who survived. We can call them the remnants of the trauma of triangular slave trade. Now, there is a white man who has been of keen interest to me. He is a Jewish and he's also an American. So we can call him an American Jewish. He's an activist and has always pioneered for the black people to have a sense of justice, for America to become stable as it was once before. He believes that for there to be justice in the United States of America, all races, including those who think of themselves as superior and those whom the superior think as inferior, should both get a chance at the high table, should both get a chance at justice, should both get a chance in education, healthcare, and all domains that are there to serve the humans of the United States of America. This Jewish American individual I'm speaking about is Tim Wise. As a white person, he had, or rather I believe that he has experienced some kind of white privilege on his side. And he thinks that, of course, I might be experiencing this white privilege, but at the expense of a fellow human, at the expense of a black American. I want us to listen to Tim Wise, get to know what he has to say, and try and learn and see how white privilege exists in the mind of a white person, because most of the time we tell white privilege from the perspective of a black person. Now let's listen to it from the perspective of a white person.
White America has never been white, and the world most certainly has never been white. Right? Most of the people in the world are not white, they don't speak English, they're not Christian, they're poor, and they're female. So they don't look anything like the folks who run the show in this place. Right? And so if we talk only about them having to assimilate to our norm and get to understand our ways, and we're isolated from a more global norm which is much more of color and much more culturally different than what we may be used to, then we're the ones who are unqualified for damn near everything in the 21st century. You see? So that's how it harms us. It also harms us by increasing the likelihood of our falling prey to those racist stereotypes that are so common. See, when you're isolated from people of color, it's much easier to think that stuff about them, that they're dangerous and they're horrible and they're coming to get you and they're going to rob you and rape you and beat you and maim you. Because that's the imagery you get in the media. That's what you see on cops. That's what you see on Real Stories of the Highway Patrol. And you don't have the personal interaction to disprove it, so you fall prey to the stereotype, and then what happens? You let your guard down to the folk building 50 bombs in your basement because you hadn't talked to them in a week and a half, and they look just like you because you gave birth to them. They're your own children. They're the children of somebody else. And so white folks are five times more likely to be attacked by another white person than by a black person, but we're looking out for black people and looking out for Latinos and looking out for poor folk generally. Meanwhile, that's not the folks who pose the greatest risk to those of us in those white enclaves. So we let down our guard to the real danger because we're looking for the danger down the block. And then when chaos comes to our community, we get on television and we say, this wasn't supposed to happen here. You know, Victor Lewis, who's one of the cast members of Color of Fear, and I know some of you know Victor, has this great analogy. He says, one of the greatest costs of privilege to those who have it that they don't realize is sort of like the Titanic. You ever see the movie The Titanic? I know some of you did. You don't want to admit it because it's sort of sappy, but it made an awful lot of money, so some of you went 2 or 3 times. And did you ever notice now, when the Titanic hits the iceberg and rips the hole in the bottom of the ship, now who are the first folks getting wet? The folks in steerage, right? The poor folks who couldn't afford a better seat, a better bed, a better cabin, right? And so they're the ones down there playing cards, having a much better time, actually, than these stuffy folks on the promenade deck, but that's a different story. And they're the ones getting wet. Now, they know what chaos is, because it's all around their feet, and they can see the water coming up, right? It's gaining, oh, well, it's gaining 6 inches every 30 minutes. Ooh, this is bad news. But of course, now they probably are yelling up to the folks on top, hey, now, we have a problem down here. But see, the folks on top have the luxury of not paying any attention to the people on the bottom because they never did. They never had to. Right? They have the luxury of ignoring them, of silencing them, of not listening to their voice. And so they don't heed the warning. Right? Until they just keep on going about their merry business, and now the water's getting a little bit higher. Now it's in third class. Pretty soon it's in second class, and pretty soon you know what happens. And it should be pointed out that one of the reasons the Titanic did not have enough lifeboats is because they wanted to add 10 feet in either direction on the promenade deck to make folks strolling and mint julep drinking a little bit more pleasurable. If they hadn't had to add those 10 feet in either direction, there would have been enough boats and nobody would have had to have died. But they had to add to the privilege, you see, of the folks who paid first class, and then folk died. See. So in a sense, it's very much the same. When folks start getting laid off, when economic downturn happens, who gets hurt first? People who are poor and working class, but then you see upper middle class, professional, white collar folks getting laid off, and then they act like the world is coming to an end because they don't know how to deal with that. You see chaos in schools and inner city, you see crime and violence there, nobody says anything, does anything, pays any attention to what the folks in those communities do in response, which many times was to implement programs to address violence. In the city schools, they do that because they've known they had to, usually with very little help from the federal government or from state governments. But suburban schools said, we don't have this problem. We don't have any violence to deal with. That's a problem for people over there. We don't need those programs. Y'all do what you need to do. We don't need those things over here. We don't live in Denver. We live in Littleton. Hello. We don't need those programs. We don't live in San Diego. We live in Santee. Hello. We don't live in Portland. We live in Springfield. Hello. You know, after a while, you start to get the point that the more and more you run from the problem and fall prey to these stereotypes, which is very easy to do even for good people, when you are privileged and isolated, you actually make yourself worse off. And the irony of it all is that when you're privileged, when you have advantages, whether those are class, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability status, or a combination of all of those, which is really sort of like, you know, the grand prize, when you have all those advantages, you actually, in a weird, very ironic way, set yourself up for a fall because you don't gain the coping skills that are necessary to negotiate crisis. Let me explain to you the reason you don't see people of color who deal with racism, a lot more than teasing now, a lot more than mere bullying, but who deal with racism. The reason you don't see poor people of any race who deal with poverty, much more than bullying or teasing. The reason you don't see young women who deal with sexism and sexual harassment and gendered violence. The reason you don't see gays and lesbians and bisexual and transgendered students, all of these non-dominant groups going in and popping everybody in their school with a heartbeat or walking into their workplace and killing everybody that can breathe, is because, oddly enough, when one is subjected to discrimination and one is constantly dealing with being devalued, you have two choices. You either learn how to cope and survive or you die. But when you're not being buffeted by oppression, when you're not being buffeted by setback, when you're not being dealt with as an inferior, when you're not being devalued, you don't have to gain those same coping skills. And you know what? 99 times out of 100, that's okay, because you're not going to need them. But it's that one time. It is that one time that you wish you had them and now you don't because you always thought it was going to go a certain way, and then you get laid off and you're 40 years old, white male, never been laid off in your life, didn't know what to make of it, and you're angry. And you're not just angry at the guy that laid you off. You're angry at everybody in the cubes next to you at work. You see? Or your girlfriend dumped you. And you don't know how to deal with it because, by God, that's not supposed to happen. You see, it's not the non-dominant group folks that go off and do the craziest stuff. Right? Oh, there's violence and crime in poor areas, for sure. Somebody gets angry at somebody and they take that person out. It's very personal. Okay? But there's this wholesale violence. Take a gun and kill how many people you can. Right? Kill them all. Let God sort them out. Right? Right? That's an attitude, the kind of chaos that you see in these privileged spaces is over the top. Right? You see all kinds of interesting things. Child sexual molestation, 75% more common in white communities than black and Latino communities. Alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, eating disorders, self-mutilation or cutting. All of these interesting pathologies, much more common among the privileged, not only white folks, but white folks with money. Now, what do all of those disorder or dysfunctions have in common? serial killing, mass murder, sexual sadism, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual molestation, all this stuff, they're all pathologies about control. Now tell me, what people in a society are more likely to develop a pathology about control? Folks who never expected to be in control, or folks who always expected to and then found something went a little wrong in their life? See, I'm suggesting to you that privilege creates this sense of entitlement, a sense of expectation that's dysfunctional, because things don't always go the way you expect. James Baldwin said it best. He said, the person who cannot suffer can never grow up, can never learn who they are, but that man who is forced to snatch his humanity from the fires of human cruelty, that rage to destroy it, learns something about himself if he survives the effort, and even if he doesn't, that no school on earth and indeed no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable. For in order to survive, he must learn to hear the meaning behind the words, to look beneath appearances, to take nothing for granted. Because when one is constantly surviving the worst that life has to bring, one eventually ceases to be controlled by the fear of what life can bring. You see? And so there comes a point where that privilege, although it sustains you if you have it for a long time, eventually it may let you down when you most need it. When I wrote that Santee piece, I got an email from a member of the Columbine SWAT team who said to me how right I was by talking about the sort of blindness of that community to think that there could be chaos there as well. He said, let me tell you what happened when we showed up at Columbine High School. We got there, those of us in the flak jackets, ready to do what we do what we would have done in Denver, which is go in and try and save whoever we could, and if people died, they died. This was a rescue event, a rescue mission. But we got there, and our commanding officer said to us, now you can't just go in there with guns blazing, because these are, and this is a direct quote, these are white people with money and nice cars, and if we do something wrong, they will sue us blind. Now here you had people with all kinds of privilege, racial and economic and geographic, all these kinds of advantage, but when they really needed it, see, it let them down. Because you have to deal with privileged people a certain way. You have to defer to them. Right? You have to kiss them in the posterior region. You have to make them happy. Right? And by making them happy, it might mean treating them better, and in the process of treating them better than you would somebody else, their kids die. Right? And so privilege has a downside. It has a flip side. Unless we make this clear to people, unless we make this part of the rap, so to speak, if all we do is list the profit side of the ledger without the loss side of the ledger, for those of us who are white, the real risk and the real damage that privilege does to us, we're only going to get the most altruistic or saintly to join this battle. We have to show folk that there is indeed a shared victimization. Oh, it's not the same. It's not that white folks are victims of institutional racism the same way, or white supremacy or white privilege the same way that people of color are, but we're victims nonetheless. We are damaged by it. It turns us into something we're not. It turns us into collaborators when we don't want to be. See, even those, the best of us who don't want to be here, and I know I'm over time, but I got to tell this last little thing and then I promise I'm done. Those of us who want to be something better and something different, those of us who resist racism, who fight it every day, this system of privilege turns us into collaborators as well. And so when I'm in 5th grade in Metro Public Schools in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm encountering a racist teacher who doesn't like me because of my close associations with black male students, and those were my friends, those are the folks I hung out with, and she was in this school system way too long, wasn't happy with that, viewed me as a race traitor, whatever kind of terminology we want to use, and made the mistake of telling my mother, made the mistake of telling her that any white parent that sent her child to school with savages was not fit to be a parent, and my mother had her removed the next week. Now wait. Now see, it happens every time. But there's another side to the story. My mom appreciates the applause, and I'll be sure to pass it on to her. But let me suggest to you something that she didn't think of and that I didn't think of at the time. Because see, we were resisting. She was resisting, and she taught me to resist, and we had this woman removed. You can't do much more resistance than that. We got rid of her. But I went back to school on Monday after she was released on Friday. And I sat in those advanced placement classrooms and honors classrooms with all white children. being told in a way much more subtle than Miss Crownover could teach it, that indeed those black children were savages. They didn't need her to teach that lesson. They could just track us in different tracks and they would teach it that way, see? Plan B. Right? And so my mom didn't see it. I went back to school and I was a collaborator with that because I didn't see it, she didn't see it, and therefore we didn't challenge it. So even the best of us are turned into something we don't want to be as long as this system exists. My grandmother, my father's mother, you've read this essay, some of you. One of the most anti-racist people I ever knew. Nobody in this room or me, myself, am going to be able to compare to her. When she was 17, she stood up to her Klan father now, because she'd fallen in love with this Jewish man who would become my grandfather and was already tired of his racism toward black folk, and this just sort of pushed her over the edge. And she went to him at the age of 17, 1937 now, and said, I'm tired of it, I'm not living with it anymore, and I'm going to give you two choices tonight, Pop. You either take your robes into the front yard and you burn them, or I am going to take your robes into the front yard and I am going to burn them. And he did it. And he quit the Klan, and he changed his life, and he accepted my grandfather and became a different man because he was challenged by this freedom fighter of a daughter of his. And she would stand up to others all throughout her life, but see, despite that commitment, despite her strength, despite the courage it took to do that, despite the clarity with which she fought racism for all of the years of her life that I knew her for sure, and going back before I was even born, for all of that, the last years of her life came, and like an awful lot of folks in this country and in this world, she began to suffer from the effects of Alzheimer's. And in those last few years of her life, if you know anything about the disease, now you know how it operates. First it takes your memories, then it makes you forget names and places and who you are and who your children are. And you go through these phases: anger, insecurity, paranoia, rage. And she went through all of them, all the while being cared for by black women. And now what do you think? In those moments of rage, in those moments of insecurity, in those moments of anger, or in those moments of paranoia, she called her black nurses when the chips were down. So you can just play it over and over in your head. You know what she called them, a word she never would have used from conscious thought and would have slapped the white off my face had I used it. But it was there, and it had been waiting. It had been hiding. It had been lurking in the far recesses of her mind for the opportunity to reassert itself and explode like a bomb, and it did it. When the chips were down, she reverted back to her conditioning because it's all she knew. She couldn't have been more clear. She couldn't have been more strong in her resistance, but it had turned her into that thing. Because when the chips were down, she had to take advantage of the only thing she had left, because her mind was gone, her health was gone, her family was gone, her memories were gone, but her whiteness remained. And so that word was one of the last words that she would utter before she stopped talking at all. And it says nothing about her. Not a thing. But it says an awful lot about her culture, and an awful lot about the place that she was raised, an awful lot about this world and this society. When you can't remember how to feed yourself, put a glass of water to your lips, or wipe your own ass. But you know what to call a black person when you're mad at them, because you were taught that around the same time that you were taught to ride a bicycle. And just like riding a bicycle, once you get it, you never forget it. You see, that's the problem, because if that's true for her, if that's what racism did to her, if that's what white privilege did to her, if that's what white supremacy did to her, then it's what it has done to me. And I will have to work the rest of my life to undo that in me, let alone in the institutions with which I interact, and so will you, because that is the cost of it to white people. Turning you into something less than the beautiful human being that you were meant to be, you see. And so if you don't think there's a cost and a price to be paid, if you think it's just about helping the other, if you think it's just about bailing them out of a jam, if you think it's just about being there for other people, don't forget that it's also about saving yourself. But we're not, because we haven't all been treated just like Americans, and the reason for it is this thing called white privilege. And if we don't talk about that, if we don't name whiteness, if we don't discuss it, then it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to understand where people of color are coming from when they are discussing racism. You see, because if it's opaque to them and invisible to us, because it can be, because we have that luxury of not seeing it, then when we talk with people of color, and we're white folks talking with people of color about racism, we're talking about two totally different things. Maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different things. Not talking about the same thing because we're not using the same language. So we have to name whiteness, we have to discuss it, because otherwise we're not going to really understand what people of color are talking about when they talk about the flip side of that privilege, which is what? Oppression. It's a word we don't like to use, right? We're much happier using these passive words. We love passive language. We say things like less fortunate. Right? Less fortunate. Here's fortune. Here you are, just a little bit less. We could just find you a little fortune, bring you up to here, it'd all be cool in the carpool. Right? Or underprivileged. Underprivileged. Here's privilege, here you are under it. Just find you a little privilege, bring you up to here, everything will be fine. Now where's your privilege that we're going to try and find? Now, you can't ask that. You want me to help find the privilege that the underprivileged don't have? Where is it? What's the opposite of underprivileged? Yeah, overprivileged. Now, have you ever heard that term used in polite company before? You'll hear the term privilege, you'll never hear anyone say overprivileged. We act like the opposite of underprivileged is just privilege, but that's not true. If someone is under what they ought to be, then that's because someone else has more of what they're not supposed to have. That is the opposite, the flip side of under. So if we talk about underprivileged people, which we have no problem doing, because it's passive, it doesn't imply that anybody did anything to anybody. Folk just woke up and here was privilege and here they were. How'd that happen? It's like the bumper sticker says. You know the R-rated version. I'll give you the PG version. The PG version is stuff happens. Right? You know the hard version. Stuff happens. Stuff doesn't just happen. Only a very privileged person could believe that. This is a bumper sticker that I know had to be created by my people, because there's no way that people of color would have come up with a sticker that says stuff happens, because they know better. Stuff gets done. Okay? Stuff gets done by people to people. Right? And back again, and back and around again. It doesn't just happen, right? But we use this passive language, and that's the problem. We can't have an honest dialogue if we keep using this passive language. Now, the other problem with talking about white privilege is that we always have the folks who want to say what? They want to say, well, now, not all white people are privileged, because they're poor white people. I have been one of those poor white people. Okay? I have been one of those white folks just above the poverty line, literally, but of course had some family to turn to. So the fact that my mom and dad didn't make a lot of money and we were just this much above welfare receipt, poverty stricken, if we used an honest definition of poverty in this country, which we don't, we would have been under the poverty line. But we had that family we could turn to, so even in the worst of our times, we had a little access to something that for the most part, the overwhelming number of people of color don't have. And what I find so interesting about this discussion, that somehow, well, since there are poor white people, there's no such thing as white privilege. What seems so preposterous about that is it ignores how racial privilege operates within a class system. Okay? We take it for granted. We understand, if we're paying attention, that we have a class system, that we have stratification and inequality on the basis of economics. And within that class system, the fact that there are white folks who are poorer than Oprah Winfrey doesn't mean anything. Because if I'm poor and I'm white and I go to the bank to get a loan and Oprah walks in next to me, I'm not competing for the same house as Oprah. We understand that. She can buy and sell me 20 times over. That doesn't change the reality of white privilege, because I'm coming in with my $50,000 in income or my $30,000 or my $20,000, and I'm competing with the black, the Latino, the Asian Pacific American, the indigenous person with 50, with 30, with 20, not Oprah. You see, within a class system, we compete against people from our own basic economic background. And that's where the racial privilege comes in at every level. And Oprah's competing with Bill Gates. And who you think wins that competition? And if Oprah goes into downtown Chicago without her makeup on to try to buy jewelry, her millions aren't going to protect her. I'll actually get the jewelry before she will. And if Tiger Woods walks on the wrong side of New York City without the Nike cap on and without flashing the smile that we all recognize, he's Amadou Diallo. Right? And so all of these folks who people trot out now to say, well, there's not racial privilege because there are these people of color, all of whom I can name, it seems. It's funny, you know. When you can name all the people that disprove the rule still stands, folks. And if you're honest, and you take it out of the racial context, this is so obvious. What I'm saying really isn't controversial if we take it out of the race context for a second and think about it in other ways. Like, for example, I think we would all probably acknowledge that to be in this country, the richest, whatever that means, most powerful, most dominant nation probably in the history of the world in some capacity, has given us as Americans or as people in this land, be they citizens or be they just folks who are living here, certain advantages, certain opportunities above the vast majority of the world's population. We're clear on that. Now, how we got all that wealth, you know, is up for dispute. Okay, but we got it. And so as a nation, we have certain privileges, certain advantages, certain one-up, if you will, on the vast majority of the people on the globe. But now, does that dispute? Of course, there are people in other parts of the globe, in other parts of the world, who are better off than some Americans. We understand that. There are people in the United States who are worse off economically in terms of their, you know, prestige and status than some people in other parts of the world. Does that mean that there isn't such a thing as American national privilege and advantage? No, it just means that as with anything, there can always be individuals who may, in some sense, go against the grain of the rule, but it doesn't disprove the rule. Similarly, there are people with a lot of money, economically privileged, and we all understand there is this thing of class privilege. There are rich folk who have miserable lives, who aren't healthy, they got all kinds of stress, they're not happy, they don't get along with their spouse, their lover, their partner, their children, their friends, they don't have any friends, they're miserable human beings. And there are some folks who are poor, who actually have lower blood pressure, are healthier, are happier. But does that mean there's not such a thing as class privilege? Well, of course not. We wouldn't even think to make that kind of an absurd comment, that there's no such thing as class privilege just because some poor people are better off, you know, physically and emotionally than some rich people. Similarly with ability status and physical ability. We all, I think, would admit that folks who are physically able-bodied have certain advantages, certain privileges. We have certain access, certain immunities, if you will, certain opportunities that are either off limits or much harder to come by for those who have physical disabilities. It's a privileged status to be able-bodied. Does that mean that there aren't some people with disabilities who are richer than folks who are able-bodied? Well, of course not. Right? There are folks who we may very well know who are very well off, have lots of prestige, lots of status, despite a serious physical disability that has limited them in some way or resulted in discrimination against them. Does that deny the reality of able-bodied privilege? Of course not, you see. And that's not controversial when I put it in those contexts. But then you bring it back to race, and we're supposed to believe that because there are some white folks worse off than some people of color, therefore this reality of white privilege as a system doesn't exist. Well, that just doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. It's not logical. It doesn't follow the facts. It doesn't follow basic common sense. But people say it anyway. Now, I could sit here and rattle off to you all of the statistical information about the material privileges that whites enjoy throughout all levels of the class system, in jobs, in education, in lending and banking, in the criminal justice system. But I'm not going to do it because I want to spend some time on other things. And if you're interested in it, you can find that data. It's out there. Like the saying, the truth is out there. The truth is out there. The data is clear, whether you're talking about lending, education, job opportunities, the criminal justice system, housing, any of these different institutional sectors. The advantages that obtain to those of us defined as white are massive and amount to billions of dollars worth of additional assets in terms of housing, tens of billions of dollars in additional assets in terms of income and money received in wages every year, even when we're not any more qualified and often less qualified than our counterparts of color. We know what the privileges are in the criminal justice system if we pay attention to things like racial profiling and who gets shot for holding the remote control in their hand and who doesn't. Made some people angry with that one in January, so I thought I'd throw it out there again. But I don't have to go through any of those numbers. All I have to do is ask you the following question, and you ask it to other folk out there, and it'll make the point as well as any statistic will. Let us pretend for a minute that I had a pill with me tonight that I could offer to you. And this pill was magic. And I offered it to everybody in the room who was white. And what this pill would do is it would render you, in the eyes of anyone who didn't already know you, Strangers like police officers you don't know, possible employers you don't know, loan officers at banks you don't know, security guards at the mall you don't know, people who see you on the street or in elevators that you don't know, would render you black or brown. Now, to the people who already knew and loved you, you'd still be your old self. So I'm not doing the experiment Andrew Hacker did a few years back where he said, you know, how much would it take for you if you're white to become black? Because that experiment was frankly flawed. Because most people don't want to change who they are, right, in either direction. Most people don't want to become something they're not. I'm modifying the experiment. That's not my experiment. I'm telling you, you get to stay who you are in the eyes of everybody who knows you and when you look in the mirror. But people who don't already know you, strangers to you who you have to go ask for a job alone, who you have to interact with when you're shopping or when they stop you on the street, they will see you as black or brown. Now, do you take the pill or do you say, I think you better keep the pill, Tim? Well, now we know what the answer is. There is not one of us, if we're being honest, that says, yeah, man, give me that pill. Give me all the pills you got. I want to be seen as black or brown in the eyes of law enforcement, in the eyes of bankers, in the eyes of employers, in the eyes of my teachers. Nothing could be better than that. Give it to me, you know. But yet now we say, even as we admit we wouldn't take the pill, we still got folks running around saying what? That the only real victim of discrimination today is the white male. Now, if that's true, hell, you'd want to take every pill I have, right? You would be paying the FDA to approve this pill. You would be on the internet buying it, forgetting Viagra, forgetting all these other things. You'd be buying the black and brown pill. If you really believed that the butter was on the black and brown side of the bread and that everything had flip-flopped, it's the very fact that nobody's taking the pill and nobody's pushing for it, and you don't even have to take the pill. You can go take Sorlin, which is already available. That's what John Howard Griffith took when he wrote Black Like Me, and that'll turn you black. And you can go on out there with your black self and get all those advantages and all those goodies that they say you get when you're black nowadays. And you can leave all that whiteness behind. And I don't see folks lining up to take that pill either, because we know, even without any statistics, without any research, without any data, all of which I could provide if I wanted to waste your time and mine, we know what the truth is. It operates invisibly to those of us who are white, even though it's opaque to people of color. And it's not just the material advantages. It's the fact that our entire mentality, those of us in the dominant group, becomes the norm, the normative mentality, the default position of the society in which we live, right? It is considered normal and regular, and so we don't have to give it a whole lot of thought. And so when something like 9/11 happens, folks can say, what? Without any sense of irony at all or misgiving, they can say two things which are stunning for how dripping they are with the condescension of white privilege. One, united we stand. Now, who is we? And how long have we been we? And when were the tryouts for this team? United who stands? See, because you talk about being a united nation when people of color have 2 to 3 times the poverty rate of white folks, 2 to 3 times the unemployment rate regardless of the health of the economy, right? 65% of all the people in jails and prisons today, black or brown, only 1/3 are white, even though 35 years ago it was the exact opposite. If we have a nation like that, and we talk about being united, then something says to me that we're just either lying to ourselves or we're just not paying attention. You see? But we say it because we can say that. Then the other one we have that was even better. Seemed like an innocuous comment, but it wasn't. And this was how it went. You heard it. After 9/11, folks said, now we know what it means to be attacked for who we are. Now we know. Naeem Akbar said it best a few months after 9/11. He said, George Bush may have discovered terrorism on September 11th. But for some people, terrorism wasn't really all that new. The only thing new about it, the only thing really new and unique about it was that it came from outside the shores of our country. For some people, for the first time. You see, it always been there in the neighborhood. Always been there in the workplace. Always been there in the jails and the prisons. Always been there in the schools. Terrorism that kills folks every bit as well and every bit as dead, albeit maybe a little more slowly and not on TV. as those who perpetrated the acts of 9/11, but we said now we know, and that too is a position of privilege. That's what's called universalizing the particular. Taking one's particular perspective, which comes from one's particular experience, and saying that is the experience of the whole country. And so white folks can say, this is what, this is what the American experience is. Well, that's the experience of some folks. It's like back a few years ago during the refugee crisis in Kosovo, I was watching CNN, and they were talking about it, and the reporter, the host of the show, Talk Back Live, it's that one where they all sit around in what looks like a shopping mall with big buttons on it says, "Hi, my name is Bob." Right? And Bob wants to say something, So they interview Bob, and Bob says something, and then the host makes some comment, and then they go to break, and the host's comment was, well, we as Americans just don't know what it's like to be uprooted from our homes and turned into refugees, and we shouldn't take that for granted. I damn near fell out of bed. Because once again, we're using we in a very interesting way. Now, who doesn't know what it means to be uprooted? See, Sim and Sylvie and Jerry and Jenny and Minerva and all their further increase, their people knew what it was to be uprooted. Mexicans who lost half their country in a war that we started know what it is to be uprooted. Native people don't know much else but being uprooted since we got here. And Japanese Americans certainly know what it is to be uprooted and stuck into internment camps. And Chinese Americans know what it is to be uprooted and used to build railroads or mine to make money for wealthier white folks and told that you can't bring your wife or your family into the country, we just want your labor, and then we'll ship you back. And then Mexican Americans in the middle of the last century, many of them citizens sent back across the border and deported under the Bracero program and sent away from this country, know what it is to be uprooted. Only a few people don't know what it is to be uprooted forcibly from their homes. But see, the folks who don't know are the folks who write copy for CNN, and the folks who do know don't write copy for CNN, and that's the difference. You see, white privilege. The privilege to define reality for everybody and expect your definition of it to stick, because you got the power to make it stick.
Now, that was the Jewish American activist. He is a social justice activist in the United States of America. And speaking about, white privilege from a white privileged individual, from a white individual who is privileged, of course, he says a set of logic that I find very intriguing. Okay, that was a bit too far in the video, but he said something about having white privilege is like someone having a muscular body. They have physical advantages. Of course, they will have some respect, they'll have some privileges that is being brought about by their physical bodies, But their physical body and their advantages does not rob someone else who does not have the physical body advantages, but they have financial assets. They have financial capabilities. And this person who has financial capabilities, they don't have a physical body and are hugely disadvantaged by this. You see, you don't have to rob Peter to pay Paul. Yeah? This person who is able-bodied does not rob this other person from their advantages. In short, Tim Wise is saying that white privilege, according to my understanding, you can share yours as well. According to my understanding is white privilege does not rob of black people their advantages they have in the United States of America. He is trying to tell us that white privilege is something which is there. It should be there, and also black people have their advantages in the United States of America, and they should just, live with it. That is according to my understanding. But I did some research based on what Tim Wise has said, and here is why I find a problem with white privilege. I think it's a huge problem to begin with. White privilege, what is it? White privilege refers to the societal advantages that white people often experience simply because of their skin color, in a system that tends to favor them over the people of color. This phenomenon has deep roots in American history. It is shaped by centuries of slavery, segregation, and racial discrimination. It also continues to influence the present-day social, economic, and political landscapes. The existence of white privilege is a complex and often uncomfortable reality for many, as it exposes the iniquities, or rather the inequities, things which are not equal, ingrained in the very structure of the American society. So white privilege is just exposing the bias system of the United States of America against the people of color. Now, we need some historical context to this issue of white privilege. It is a problem. To understand the problem of white privilege, it is essential to examine the historical context in which it developed. Beginning with the colonization of America, the institution of slavery played a pivotal role in the creation of a racial hierarchy. Enslaved Africans were considered property and were systematically denied the basic rights and freedoms enjoyed by white settlers. After the abolition of slavery, laws and practices such as the ones of Jim Crow segregation continued to enforce racial inequality in the U.S. These historical injustices laid the foundation for systemic racism, creating a society in which white individuals were afforded privileges that people of color were not. In the early 20th century, despite legal victories in the civil rights movement, the underlying structures of white privilege persisted. Discriminatory practices in housing, education, and employment continued to disadvantage Black Americans and other people of color, often through subtle and institutionalized means. These historical and ongoing patterns of racial discrimination continued to shape the lived experiences of both white people and people of color in the Americas. Yeah. Now, how does this issue of white privilege manifest? It is a thing that we should ask ourselves. White privilege has manifested itself in various aspects of everyday life, often in ways that go unnoticed by those who benefit from it. You understand? One of the most significant areas is in the criminal justice system. Studies have shown that Black Americans are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and sentenced more harshly than white Americans of similar offenses. White individuals are also more likely to be given the benefit of the doubt in interactions with law enforcement and are less likely to be subjected to racial profiling. In education domain, white students generally attend schools with more resources, higher quality teachers, and better facilities than their Black and Latino counterparts. In the job market, white applicants are more likely to be hired than equally qualified people of color, and they are offered higher salaries and greater opportunities for advancement. Housing discrimination, while illegal, it also persists through practices such as redlining, which systematically denies Black families access to mortgages in certain neighborhoods, ensuring that white communities maintain economic and social advantages. White privilege also operates on a cultural level. White Americans dominate the media, politics, and the arts, often shaping the narrative about what is normal or acceptable in the society. An example is this: white people see their experience, values, and interests reflected in a wide range of cultural and political representation, while people of color often encounter marginalization or stereotyping. Now, let's look at the impact of white privilege. The consequences of this white privilege are far-reaching and have a profound impact on both individuals and the society. For white people, privilege can foster a sense of entitlement, an awareness of the struggles faced by the people of color, and a lack of empathy for those who experience discrimination. It can also perpetuate a cycle of social and economic disparity, making it difficult for people of color to break free from the barriers of systemic inequality. For people of color, white privilege manifests as a persistent reminder of their second-class status in a system that consistently denies them equal opportunities. This can contribute to feelings of frustrations, alienation, and powerlessness. In addition, the disparities created by white privilege can hinder social mobility, creating long-lasting effects on the economic and psychological well-being of marginalized communities. Let's address the issue of white privilege. This issue being addressed, it is the problem of white privilege. The problem of white privilege is not one that can be solved overnight. Of course, it can't be. But it is crucial to recognize and confront it in order to work towards a more and a just society. First, education. Education plays a central role in addressing white privilege. It is there to raise awareness about the history and continuing impact of racial inequality, which can help white individuals understand how privilege operates and how they can use their position to advocate for justice and equality. Second is this: systemic change is necessary. This includes reforming the social justice system, improving access to quality education and healthcare, creating more inclusive workplace environments, and dismantling discriminatory practices in housing. Policy changes alone are not enough. There must be a cultural shift towards greater empathy and understanding of the lived experiences of the people of color. And finally, white people must actively engage in anti-racist work. This includes listening to the voices of people of color, supporting movements that seek to dismantle systemic inequality, and using their privilege to amplify marginalized voices. We have allyship, which also requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths like the ones we've seen Tim Wise do, challenging the harmful stereotypes and also advocating for lasting social change. White privilege is a deeply entrenched issue in America, one that perpetuates racial inequality and creates a society where opportunities and rights are redistributed unfairly. By acknowledging its existence, understanding its impact, and taking collective action to address it, Americans can work towards building a society that truly values equality, justice, and the inherent dignity of all its citizens. Only through sustained effort and solidarity can the problem of white privilege be confronted and overcome. Yeah. I believe that Tim Wise is really doing a nice job by confronting these truths, and it's not comfortable. Not so many white people can do what Tim Wise is doing. He's somebody who's grown through difficulties. He's born from a poor family. He did not come from a rich one. And so he's struggled his way to where he is. So he's actually to understand these struggles. There are some struggles that you can only understand them if you've passed through them. You understand? And for Tim Wise, even though he was passing through the same challenges, difficult challenges, he still confirms with us that they are not similar to those of black. He says that the black ones are very intense. When I say black ones, I mean the majority of them, because we still have some rich black people, such as Oprah Winfrey. We have Tyler Perry. We have the guy who acts movies, Tyrese Gibson. Many of these individuals have not passed through difficulties. And for Tim Wise, he is assuring us that on his side, he will try and create awareness, and we love this. Yeah. So if you like what I do, if you find value in my work, kindly subscribe to the channel, support me on Patreon, just become a paid member. Please, even if you can give $1 per month, it is okay with me. Just $1, if you can do that for a month, it will be okay. It will help me bring resources and bring myself presentable and more quality content on your way. Yeah. This is EFK original documentary. Subscribe and see you in the next one.